Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Omar, and I'm an assistant professor in Arabic and Islamic Studies here at Georgetown University. I'd like to welcome you all to our new series where you get to meet scholars and hear them discuss their intellectual journeys. My guest today is Dr. Jonathan Brockopp, professor of history and religious studies at Pennsylvania State University. You can find his full biography on this page. Dr. Brockopp, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Omar. Great to see you. And great to be with you.
So I'd like to have us start by maybe hearing a little bit about you, having you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to your specific areas of research. I think sometimes we forget that, there are real humans behind the writing. And so I'm hoping this will be an opportunity for us to hear a little bit more about you and get to know you a little bit better.
Yeah, and thanks for this opportunity.
You're welcome.
So my story is a little strange in that I came to Islamic studies with a really roundabout journey. My undergraduate degree is in actually Chinese history. And then I took 3 years off before starting grad school and worked for a year in a hotel. And then I took a bike trip across the eastern U.S. and ran into a college friend of mine who was doing volunteer work. So I joined this volunteer organization in Chicago, worked there for a year, and then met these Germans who said, why don't you come over to Germany and do the same thing? So I ended up working for a German peace movement for another year. And then I thought, I'm going to go back to grad school. So the advice I got from one of my teachers was, you've been out of school for a long time, so you better get some, show that you're really interested in this. And so I was living over in Germany at the time, and through a very weird back channel, I got myself enrolled in Tübingen University and did the first year of my graduate work at Tübingen in religious studies. I knew at that point I wanted to do religious studies. I didn't know I wanted to study Islam, but they had, of course, a world famous Islamic studies program there, and I started taking Arabic there and decided, okay, so I think I'll do this. And so then I applied, and this is, it's a very different world. We're talking about 1988 here, in that there weren't that many people interested in studying Arabic and Islamic studies. And so I actually got into every program I had applied to, ended up going to Yale. And I think the reason that Yale liked me is because Gerhard Böhring, who is still there actually, is German and just liked the idea that I was fluent in German and as a foundation for my foray into Islamic studies. So that was the start of it all, and getting into Yale that way. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so why don't we maybe take a minute and have you tell us a little bit about the scope of your scholarship and the types of questions you've asked over the course of your career and how those questions may have shifted and evolved over time. And I know you've written widely on so many different topics, including the origins of Islam and its rise in the Judeo-Christian context and Muslim medical ethics and the formation of Islamic law and even Islam and ecology and among so many other publications. So I won't list them all, but I'd love to hear how, again, the types of research questions that you've asked have changed and what are some of those questions that have driven your work?
Yeah, so when I got to Yale, I was still very much learning the field. And it sort of surprised me to realize that there was so much about the first centuries of Islam that we still don't know and could know. The manuscript riches of the first centuries in comparison with Christianity. Now, again, I come at the study of Islam very much from a comparative religious perspective. So I also have a background in Judaism and Christianity and an interest in all religious traditions. So, whenever any new manuscript shows up in early Christianity, early Judaism, it shocks the scholarly world and changes everything. And yet we have hundreds of manuscripts from the first centuries of Islam that are simply unknown, unedited, never really cataloged properly. And so this was a mystery. And it really, I found it very attractive. So my first book then was on a set of manuscripts surrounding one of Malik ibn Anas's students. And that continued to be a very productive line of inquiry. But I always had big questions that I wanted answered. And so one of the big questions was, why do people do what they do from a religious perspective? So I focused that dissertation on slavery, partly because the chapters on slavery were the ones that were preserved in multiple manuscripts. But also, I was just, slavery. How does slavery look like in a different cultural context? I had no idea. And so it's something I really was curious about and wanted to know more. At the same time at Yale, I also pursued an interest in ethics and worked with Jean Autka there. So it was kind of a graduate minor in comparative religious ethics. And so from this point of law into ethics, especially for Islamic law, it's really very close. A lot of Muslim ethical intuition comes out of law and the desire to follow God's commands and God's will for the world. So it was pretty easy to do, but I don't know anything about Muslim modern views on abortion or euthanasia or things. And so this was a beginning of a collaborative work for me, and I really started to enjoy this. I did a number of collaborative pieces where I was the editor, but just gathering all these interesting scholars who work on fields that I don't know anything about. And one of the things I dislike about most edited volumes is that they don't hang together. There's no central question that they're trying to answer. So in all of my edited volumes, we met together as a group first, sometimes at conferences, or sometimes for the Muslim medical ethics volume, we actually had a conference before we made the volume and started to bring up discussions and lines of thought that connected us so that the volume, even though it's written by 8 or 9 different authors, you have some kind of coherence to it. So working in collaboration then is something that I really enjoyed. When I moved to Penn State, though, as a research university, they don't care about edited volumes. So I had to start paying attention to what they cared about. And, they have this idea of the scholar hero that we are to be ourselves, leaders in the field and breaking new ground, and collaboration doesn't count. So, and I don't mind this is being taped. I mean, it's just the way it is. So I had to pay attention to that and write another scholarly monograph. And by this time, I had, of course, done lots of different other things. And so I come back to the early period, then, the work of my dissertation, and I start to see this in a new way. This has to do with my interest in leadership. So I wrote a little article a long time ago on charismatic leadership in the Prophet Muhammad, and seeing the Prophet Muhammad as a charismatic figure and the way that history changes our view of the past. So when we look in retrospect at someone like the Prophet, from different perspectives, whether it's a Sufi perspective or a legal perspective, or someone who's an expert in Quranic studies, or someone who's a politician, they're going to see the Prophet and value the things about the Prophet in a way that's unique to their own times and circumstances. So what happens then to this perfect example, the Prophet Muhammad, who in this historical process really becomes all things to all people? And so that question then has been something that I worked out in the Cambridge Companion to Muhammad. So you'll see that theory sort of working itself out in that book, because I chose experts from these different fields and asked them to think about the role of the Prophet Muhammad as lawgiver, as theologian. And one of my favorite chapters is the one that Anna Gade did on the Prophet Muhammad in modern Indonesia, where she talks about Muhammad as an example for teachers. It's an example for business people. And all kinds of ways that books that have come out about Prophet Muhammad management. So proper being a good business manager, like the Prophet Muhammad. And so these questions, then taking them back to the early period and trying to see what can we know about the development of Muslim scholars on the basis both of the stories that are told about them in retrospect, but also comparing that with material evidence, the manuscripts especially, that we have. And how do those two sources give us a different perspective? So that was a lot of fun to write, and it allowed me to go back again to these old materials and really to see them in a new way.
Wow. I guess at this point, I'm wondering, you've it looks like you've done so many different things, and you've had a really long and productive career. And the question that arises is, how have your methods or approaches or even the theories that you're using, how have those shifted as you embark upon different projects and different writing topics for writing? How has that changed as also the fields are changing over time?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there are some things that I simply felt that I needed to stop working in. So ethics, for example, when I wrote that first, or edited the first volume on Muslim medical ethics, there were very few people working on Islamic ethics per se. In Satchidina, you had a few people who had been out there, a number of people talking from a kind of prescriptive Islamic law perspective, a few anthropologists, but there weren't a lot. And now there's a whole society for the study of Muslim ethics. And it, has been a neat project for me to be able to make a contribution at the beginning of a field and then draw back and go into something else. I have ideas. I don't need to work on just one thing. And so in terms of the study of manuscripts, one of the things I realized is that if I don't work on these, nobody's going to. And so it drove me back to work on the manuscripts. But your question about methodology is really interesting, because my first book is very much a kind of critical historical approach to a text. And it still rose out of that textual tradition. I challenged it a few ways. There's some subterfuge in there, some ways that I tried to undermine the power of this historical critical method. But fundamentally, that's what informed it. Since then, I've really become interested in the materiality of the manuscript itself. The manuscript as a material object. And my current project, the Caravan Manuscript Project that I run, is one that involves not only historians and scholars of text, but also conservators and experts on things like bookbinding and the production of the actual physical material, whether it's parchment, whether it's animal skin, or whether it's paper. And to be working with all these different scholars, experts on ink, or experts on the different pigments used to decorate manuscripts, that just helps us to start to see these objects in a very different light. And yet they're the same thing that I've been working on for 30 years. So that's really enjoyable for me, is to have this field changing. And I think in some ways myself to have the confidence to work in an interdisciplinary environment where ignorance just has to be the beginning, that I don't know. And so I'll work with people who are interested in working with me so that we can learn together about this object or this person.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Brockopp, for really taking us through your intellectual journey and for sharing some of your ideas with us. This is really fascinating. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Welcome.